This morning we begin a new sermon series. In this series we'll be walking step by step through the 9th chapter of John's account of the life of Jesus. It's a wonderful story with lots of twists and turns. Just when you think you know what's going to happen next, events go in a different direction. And it's one that is just chock full of wisdom about life for you and for me. So I'm looking forward to that together as we launch in this morning with the first 5 verses of John chapter 9. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." There was silence in the cubicle in the intensive care unit. Silence except for the clicking and beeping of all of the machines that were plugged into the body of a 29-year-old mother of 3 who was losing her battle to live. Finally, the silence was broken when her husband turned to me and said, "Why did this happen to her? She never drank, she never cussed, she was nice to everybody. Why did this happen to her?" We've all asked that question at one time or another. Underneath it is the conviction that bad things represent punishment for some sin. And therefore, it makes no sense when some tragedy befalls someone who, as far as we can tell, is upstanding. There's that conviction that you get, or at least you ought to get, what you deserve. And good things should happen to good people, and bad things should happen to bad people. That philosophy was deeply ingrained in the people of Jesus' day. So much so that the thought was you could look at somebody, and if they were prosperous, you would say they are living a life that pleases God. And if they were in trouble, you would say they have committed some terrible sin. And that's why Jesus' followers asked their fascinating question that day. Who sinned, this man or his parents? You see, the man was born blind. And that's the logical question to ask. If he was born blind, is it something he did that he was actually punished for before he did it? Or was it a punishment of his parents? And Jesus replies, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned." Jesus isn't saying they never did anything wrong. He's not saying, add to your roster of sinless human beings these 3, so now we have 4, me, the man, his mother, and his father. He's saying they have committed no heinous offense worthy of being punished by this man being sightless from birth. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. Jesus is jolting them and us out of that implacable logic that looks for why we deserve whatever happened to us. The logic that makes us ask, why? Jesus is making very clear that there is no necessary link between whether we're good and good circumstances or whether we're bad and bad circumstances. And so it is that Jesus came teaching and modeling a God of grace, a God of undeserved kindness, a God who doesn't give us what we deserve, who gives us more than we deserve. And Jesus wants to free us from the unyielding calculus of merit, where you get what you earn. And to ask why is to make a fundamental misreading of the character of God. We do not have a score-keeping God. We have a God of grace. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. Then Jesus goes on and says, this happened that the works of God might be revealed in his life. In other words, God is at work in this life. God is at work in every life, in the particular circumstances of that life. And God is at work for good. And so we don't ask, what did this man do or his parents to deserve this? We ask, what is God doing now? What is God doing, not despite the man's disability, but in and through it? This happened so that the works of God might be revealed in this man's life. And of course, it is our ultimate glory of human beings, whatever our situations and however challenging our lives may be, for the work of God to be revealed in our lives, for us to experience God's merciful and gracious plan for us. So Jesus calls us not to seek the cause for our trouble, but to ask what God wants to result from it. Not to look backward to discern what I did to deserve this, but to look at what God is doing now and to look forward to what God seeks to bring out of it. In her new novel, Lila, Marilyn Robinson depicts the preacher John Ames as speaking to exactly this question with these beautiful words. Things happen for reasons that are hidden from us, utterly hidden, for as long as we think they must proceed from what has come before, our guilt or our deserving, rather than coming to us from a future that God in his freedom offers to us. How would our perspective change if we saw things happening, coming from a future that God in his freedom offers us? To say that the question Jesus calls us to is, how is God at work in my situation now? What is God calling me to? That's not the same, I believe, as the old cliche, God's teaching me a lesson through this. Now, often God's good work in the tough times is a lesson that we learn, a lesson that benefits us, that blesses us through our lives when the growth remains after the pain has faded. But I find that truism often creates frustration and resentment. I hear so many people saying, I know God's trying to teach me a lesson in my suffering, and I want to learn it, and I'm trying to learn it, but God won't show it to me. Because I know if God showed it to me and I learned it, then I wouldn't be suffering anymore. And we experience this kind of cruel, divine hide and seek where God's trying to conceal his lesson from us just to keep us miserable. And that's very different from saying, what is God doing? How is God at work right now? What is God calling me to? What is God offering me right now? I want to say that Jesus' perspective from John 9 is also very different from simply saying, it's God's will. It's God's will. First of all, when people are in times of suffering and pain, it doesn't help to say it's God's will. It just makes things worse. But beyond that, there are some things that just aren't God's will. Rape and murder are not God's will. The poor starving because the rich won't share is not God's will. Beyond that, it's God's will sometimes inspires a kind of fatalism in the rest of the people who are around the one who is suffering. Well, that's just the way God wants it to be. But listen to how Jesus goes on here. Jesus says, this happens so that the works of God might be revealed in his life. And then Jesus says, we must work the works of him who sent me. Jesus looks at his disciples and said, the works of God are being revealed in him, and guess what? We're the ones who God is working them through. And of course, Jesus will go on to heal the man. But that will turn out to be the beginning and not the end of God's works being revealed in him. But Jesus says, God's works are being revealed, and guess what? We're called to be God's agents. We're called to be God's hands and feet and voice. We're called to stand with people in their suffering and to do what we can to alleviate their suffering. The perspective of Jesus does not make us fatalists, it makes us activists. Now you may want to say, it's all very well to speak about asking the question, what is God doing in this situation? Where is God calling us? Makes real sense when Jesus is about to heal the guy. But what about when the healing doesn't come? What about when there isn't a happy Hollywood ending? That seems to happen more often than not. And friends, on the authority of Jesus himself, we can believe that our good God is still at work. Our good God is still calling us forward. The Apostle Paul had a physical affliction. Was one that was great enough so that he begged and begged and begged and begged God to take it away. Knowing what we do of Paul, he probably wasn't pleading selfishly. Rather, he was probably saying, God, I can accomplish so much more for you if you would just take this thorn in the flesh away. And after a long time of entreating God desperately, Paul heard an answer from God. My grace is sufficient for you, My strength is made perfect in your weakness. In other words, you're going to keep wrestling with this affliction. But my grace will uphold you, and not only that, the work you're trying to accomplish in me will be furthered. Because instead of people saying, isn't Paul great? They'll say, look at Paul. This can only be God working through him. When I think of times that the miracle doesn't come, I find myself in another hospital room with a gentleman from my first church whose family had found out that their prayers for the miracle were not going to come to fulfillment, that their father was going to die. Not only that, but it became increasingly apparent that this death would be neither short nor easy. He was lying there in the hospital bed, unable to communicate, with the pain medication at best just holding even and often not doing that. I stood there alone praying for him. And in my prayers I said, God, this just seems like meaningless suffering. But I saw things differently as the weeks progressed. And I ended up there many times when this man's children were present. These children had had a falling out years before. There were deep and angry divisions between them, long-standing bitterness and alienation. Yet as they kept finding themselves at first uncomfortably around their father's bed, they ended up reconciling. And it turns out that those last weeks of that gentleman were anything but meaningless suffering. The works of God were being revealed in and through his situation, even though he may never have known it. And so it is for all of us. We may never see exactly how the works of God are being revealed, but we can trust that they are. And I don't want to speak glibly about any of this as if somehow this all makes it simple or this takes away our pain. I know too much of people suffering and struggles to say that. The ways of God are ultimately a mystery, not a formula. But they are good, and God is at work. Helmut Thielicke pastored a congregation in Stuttgart, Germany during the Second World War. He was a critic of the Nazi regime, but somehow he was allowed to retain his freedom, even though he had periodic uncomfortable conversations with the Gestapo. By 1944, the general population of Germany had become disillusioned with the war that their totalitarian government insisted on prosecuting to the bitter, hopeless end. And there was an amazing amount of suffering those people endured. 1,000 German soldiers were dying every day on the Russian front. Cities like Stuttgart were subjected to bombing raids frequently. And on the Sunday following an air raid that had left the neighborhood of Helmut Thielicke's church nothing but smoldering ruins, he preached a sermon on exactly this passage from the book of John. He reflected on the question why that was on everybody's mind, and how that question perversely turns us in on our own selves and ends up ultimately amplifying our pain. He said, Do we not all know this troublesome questioner within who in contempt or despair, in sorrow or accusation, constantly asks why? This little word why is no torrent of speech. It is only a little drop of 3 letters, yet it can cause mortal injury to our souls. He went on to say that we need to change the question. Instead of asking why, we ask, to what end? To what end? We need to stop looking backward for something we've done to cause this and start looking forward to the future to which God is calling us. To what end? We ask. What is God doing in and through my situation, even my suffering?